Frank Dalton woke before dawn, as he always did, to the soft whisper of wind through pine trees and the gentle lapping of lake water against the shore. He stepped out of his small wooden cabin and took a deep breath of the cool morning air. Mist curled above the lake, turning the water surface into a silent sea of pale gray. For Frank, these quiet moments were the best part of each day. He filled his metal cup from the old kettle, warming on the stove, poured hot coffee, and walked slowly down the narrow path he had cleared himself. Every stone and stick on that trail held a memory of his work and care. He found his favorite spot on a smooth, flat rock just above the waterline. He sat down, cupped his hands around the coffee mug, and watched the first hint of light appear on the horizon. A single loon called out, and Frank smiled. He had spent more than 30 years coming here. When he was younger, he had built this camp with his own hands, fitting the logs together, nailing each board, and sanding the rough edges until they were smooth. He had planted berry bushes and painted the walls a gentle green. His daughter Emily had learned to fish at the edge of this lake. His wife Marie had loved to watch the sunset with him from that very rock. Though Marie and Emily now lived miles away in the city, the camp still felt full of their laughter and warmth. Frank finished his coffee slowly, then rose to stretch his shoulders. He loved this simple routine, a short walk to the trail he had carved, a quiet coffee break, and then hours of reading, fishing, or tinkering with old tools. Today, he planned to repair a small leak in the cabin's roof before setting out a net for crappie by midday. He had everything he needed: a toolbox full of wrenches, hammers, and nails, cooler for fish, and a small stove for making stew. At night, he carried the kettle back inside and placed it by the stove. As he reached for a screwdriver, he noticed a bright yellow envelope taped to the cabin door. His heart skipped. Official letters were rare here, usually just postcards or the trail map he sent to visitors. He set down the screwdriver and opened the envelope. Inside was a letter stamped with the letters HOA in bold black ink. His eyes narrowed as he read the words, notice of violation and intent to seize property. He could not believe what he saw. Read the letter again, to make sure he had not misread. It claimed his camp was too close to the water's edge, that he was in breach of the Homeowners Association's setback rule, and that unless he removed the cabin within 30 days, the HOA would move to seize the property. Frank's chest tightened with shock and anger. 30 years of memories, hard work, and peace were at stake. He sank onto a wooden chair and stared at the paper. The HOA had rules, of course, but no one had ever mentioned this problem before. He had built his camp with care, following the general guidelines he had been given when he first arrived. How could this notice come now, after all these years? Who had reported him? He ran a hand over his graying hair and thought of calling his attorney, but he wanted to calm himself first. With a slow breath, Frank folded the letter and placed it on the small table beside his chair. He rose and went outside again, this time to the edge of the lake. He scanned the cabin from the water's edge and measured, in his mind, the distance from its foundation to the shoreline. It looked much like it always had, maybe barely touching the minimum allowed distance, but never beyond it. No tree roots had shifted, no bank had eroded that much. He shook his head. Something was wrong. That afternoon, he packed a light lunch peanut butter sandwich, an apple. Wateran set out for the little community center where the HOA held its monthly meetings. He walked along the gravel road, passing a few other cabins and summer homes. A couple of neighbors waved, but Frank's mind was busy. He wanted answers. He wanted to know who had sent this notice and why, after so many peaceful years. At the community center, the parking lot was nearly empty. A single old pickup truck sat by the entrance, flashlights still flicking on the dash. Frank entered a room with folding chairs set in rows, and a long table at the front, where the HOA board members sat. He saw a dozen people milling about, whispering. Quietly, as soon as Frank's boots clicked against the floor, a hush spread over the room. Heads turned toward him. He carried himself with a calm confidence born of years outdoors. He greeted the board president, Margaret Hill, with a firm handshake. "Margaret," he said, holding the letter behind his back for a moment, "I received this notice about my camp. I'd like to discuss it." Margaret's face was tight. She glanced at the letter in his hand. Mr. Dalton, the board decided this last week. You know the rules. You should have known about the setback requirement. Frank shook his head. I built this camp 30 years ago. I followed the guidance I was given back then. No one ever told me I was out of compliance. Why now? Margaret looked uncomfortable. She pressed her lips together and glanced at the others on the board. We have new rules. We've recently surveyed all Lakeside properties. Yours is too close. I have to ask you to remove it. Remove it? Frank's voice grew firm. You want me to destroy 3 decades of my life? I deserve a fair chance to talk about this. The room grew tense. Their neighbors whispered to each other. Frank felt their eyes on him, some curious, some sympathetic. The HOA board offered no immediate solution. They had checked the map, they said. Their decision was final unless he hired a surveyor to prove otherwise at his own expense. Frank left the meeting with his heart heavy. Outside he paused under an old oak tree. Leaves drifted around. He felt alone, but only for a moment. He thought of home, this cabin, his memories, the smell of pine, the sound of loons. He could not let that go without a fight. He would call his attorney, he decided. He would gather the old photographs of the camp under construction. He would show that he had permission back then. He would not back down. On the walk back, he stopped by his neighbor Lucy Carter's cabin. Lucy was a kind woman who had lived here since before Frank arrived. She offered him a cup of tea. He told her what had happened. Lucy's eyes filled with anger on his behalf. That HOA board is bullies, she said softly. We need to stand together. You're not alone. Frank thanked her, but he knew he needed a plan. He returned to his camp as the sun dipped low in the sky. Shadows stretched across the path, and the air grew cold. He entered his cabin and lit a small oil lamp. He spread the HOA letter on the table and pulled out a notepad. He began to write down everything he could remember about the camp's history, the day he first stepped on this land. The man who sold it, the clearance permit he obtained, the old photo of his daughter in her red raincoat, standing at the water's edge. He sketched the cabin outline and wrote that survey lines had been staked by the community engineer back then. He wrote until his hand ached. When he finally looked up, the lamp had burned low, and a tiny circle of light glowed on the table. Outside, he heard the gentle breeze through the pine needles and the soft sigh of the lake. He placed the notepad and letter in a drawer. He felt a strange mix of exhaustion and determination. He knew he had to do something bold. He thought of his herd of Charolais bulls grazing in the pasture a few miles inland. They were gentle giants, and he had raised them from calves with patience and care. He smiled at the thought. He would not unleash them without good reason, but he also would not let his home be taken without standing his ground. That night, Frank lay on his bedroll, listening to the wind and water. He thought of his father, who had taught him that a man must protect what he loves. He thought of Marie's laughter, of Emily's excited voice when she caught her first fish here. He felt a spark of hope. Tomorrow, he would call his lawyer. But right now, he closed his eyes, breathing in the scent of pine and wood smoke, determined to keep his lakeside haven safe for himself, for his family, and for the years of peace he had earned. Ask ChatGPT. Frank felt his pulse quicken as he drove away from the community center. The wind rattled the old pickup's windows, carrying the scent of pine and evening rain. He gripped the steering wheel and thought about that meeting. The HOA board had been cold and unyielding. They had handed him a second notice, stamped in red, final notice of violation and notice of escalating fines. Each day beyond 30 days would cost him $50, the letter said. Soon, the fines would pile up into thousands. He needed a plan and fast. By the time he reached the dusty gravel road that led to his camp, the sky had turned purple. Frank parked near the small pasture he used to keep his tools and supplies. He stepped out of the truck and stretched his back. His muscles ached from bending over to lift boxes at the community meeting, from the tension of the day. He took a deep breath and walked the short distance to his cabin. The door creaked as he opened it, and he set the letter on the kitchen table. The lamp's glow cast dancing shadows on the rough wooden walls. He sat down across from the letter and rubbed his temples. In simple, even writing, the HOA spelled out their demands: remove the cabin or face daily fines. Remove any structures within 10 feet of the shoreline. Remove all personal items or they would auction off everything. Frank felt a knot in his stomach. He had so little time. He could not afford a huge legal battle. But neither could he imagine tearing down his camp. It was the place where he felt most alive. He poured himself a cup of tea from the kettle and let the warm steam rise against his face. He remembered the day he had moved in. It had been early spring. He had driven the old truck along this gravel road, hauling wooden boards and tools, dreaming of the quiet years ahead. In the bright morning sun, he had unloaded his cabin kit and laid down each log with care. He had sunk the corner posts himself and hoisted the walls piece by piece. His hands had been rough and strong then, but his heart had overflowed with hope. Now, his hands were rough from age, and his heart was heavy with worry. He sighed and stood, moving to the small bookshelf. He pulled down a dusty folder he kept from the first year he arrived. Inside was a faded survey map of the property. Lines stamped by the county surveyor. He had taken these papers to the county offices himself and paid the fees and attended the meeting, and had gotten official permission to build just where the land sloped gently toward the water. He flipped through the papers to find the surveyor's stamp and signature. It showed the cabin's footprint, the porch, the small woodshed, and the lean-to for storing firewood. None of it lay within the restricted zone according to that map. Frank frowned. He needed more evidence. He opened his laptop and booted it up. With a soft whir, the screen lit up. He pulled up a folder of photographs he had taken while building the camp. One photo showed him standing next to the porch with Emily, his daughter, her small hand gripping his big finger. That photo was dated June 12, 1995. Another showed him on a ladder, hammer in hand, with Marie placing boards on the roof. The date on that one was August 7, 1995. The photo showed a bright red ribbon tied around a wooden stake marking the approved boundary line. He zoomed in on the ribbon, its color almost glowing in the sunlight of the picture. These photos were his proof. He saved copies to a new folder called HOA Defense. He printed out 2 sets of each document and photo. He would need them for his attorney and for the HOA board if they would even see him. His shaking fingers set the printer buzzing in the corner. As the pages slid out, he took another sip of tea. The warmth from the cup spread through his hands, but did little to warm the chill in his heart. Once the papers lay neatly on the table, Frank picked up the phone and dialed his daughter, Emily. He knew she was busy working as a teacher in the city, but he also knew she loved this camp as much as he did. The phone rang. It felt like ages before she answered. "Hi, Dad," she said brightly. "How's everything at the lake?" He cleared his throat. "Hi, sweetie. Listen, I need to talk to you about something serious." "Okay," she replied. "You sound worried." He took a deep breath. "The HOA says I built too close to the lake. They want to take my cabin down or they'll seize it. They've sent me 2 letters. They say I have 30 days to remove everything or I face thousands in fines." There was a pause. You could almost hear Emily's heart beating on the other. "And? What? Dad, that can't be right. You've been here for 30 years. I know," he said softly. "I have the old survey map and photos. I'm meeting with an attorney tomorrow. I wanted you to know. I'm scared, Em." Daughter's voice grew firm. "I'll fight this, Dad. I'll come up this weekend. Between the 2 of us, we'll sort out the papers and make sure they can't do this." Her tone was brave, even though he could sense her worry. "Hang in there. I'll call that attorney for you, okay?" "Thanks, sweetheart," he said. Fighting tears. It means the world. He hung up the phone and folded his hands on the table, felt a wave of gratitude. He was not alone in this fight. The next morning, Frank arrived at the small law office in town. The building was a simple brick structure with a faded sign that read Miller and Page, Attorneys at Law. Entered and was greeted by a septuagenarian receptionist with a knowing smile. "You must be Mr. Dalton," she said. "Mr. Miller will see you now." Frank followed her down a narrow hallway into a cluttered office. Books lined the shelves from floor to ceiling. The attorney, A gray-haired man with sharp eyes and a gentle voice rose from behind a massive oak desk. "Mr. Dalton, nice to meet you," he said, offering a firm handshake. "I've read the HOA letters. They've presented their case, but it is weak." Frank sat down, relief warming him. "I have the old survey map and photos showing the cabin was built within the approved boundary. I also have the original permit documents." The attorney nodded and spread the papers across his desk. He scanned them carefully, his eyes flicking. From document to map to photo. "Excellent," he said. "They can't ignore these. We'll draft a formal response on Monday, demanding they withdraw their seizure notice. We'll make it clear that any attempt to auction your property would be unlawful." "HOA law can be slow," the attorney said. "But with clear evidence, we can move quickly. We'll file papers in the county court, and they'll have to respond within 30 days. If they fail, we win by default. If they respond, we go to a hearing. Either way, we have strong grounds." Frank felt hope return. He left the law office, clutching copies of the drafted response. On his drive back, the morning sun shone bright. He stopped by the feed store to pick up a bale of hay for his herd. The store owner, an old friend named Carl, waved and asked how he was doing. "Battling bureaucracy," Frank said with a half-smile. Carl laughed. "Those folks at the HOA can't stand a man with courage. They expect everyone to follow their rules, but sometimes their rules are unfair." Frank nodded. "I've got my daughter coming up this weekend to help, and I have an attorney drafting my defense. I feel better, but I know they could still try to push me." Carl placed a hand on Frank's shoulder. "Just keep your head up. You've done nothing wrong. I'll see that." Back at the camp, Frank unloaded the hay and carried it to the pasture. He scattered it for the herd and watched as the Charolais bulls ambled over, gentle and patient. He scratched the head of the oldest bull, whose soft brown eyes looked at him trustingly. He spoke to them in a low, calm voice, as if telling them everything would be okay. They snorted softly in return, flicking their tails. That evening, back in his cabin, Frank wrote in his journal. He recorded each step he had taken: the meeting with the board, the phone call with Emily, the visit to the attorney, and the trip to the feed store. He dated each entry and noted his next task: file the response, gather more witness statements from neighbors, and prepare for the hearing. He closed the journal and lay back on his cot. The night was still. Crickets sang in. The grass in the lake lay as calm as glass. Though uncertainty loomed, Frank felt a steady resolve. He would not let the HOA take his home. He would stand up for what was right and protect his years of memories. And as he drifted off to sleep, he thought of Emily's promise that together they would win this fight. In the quiet darkness, he allowed himself to hope. Frank woke before sunrise, his mind buzzing with plans. He lay still on his cot for a moment, listening to the soft creak of the cabin settling in the cool morning air. Outside, the first birds began their chirping. He rolled off the cot and, dressed in his old leather coat and sturdy boots. Today, he decided, he would take the fight directly to the HOA. But he knew words and papers might not be enough. He needed something memorable. He walked outside and filled his metal cup with hot coffee from the kettle. Steam curled upward in the dawn light. He sipped slowly, savoring the warmth, and thought back to his herd of Charolais bulls grazing in the fields a few miles away. They were gentle animals, but their size and presence commanded respect. His idea had begun as a half-joke with his friends. But now, it felt like the perfect way to show the HOA how serious he was about protecting his home. After breakfast, he loaded his old pickup with equipment: portable fencing panels, sturdy stakes, ropes, flashlights, and a couple of loud bullhorns he kept for emergencies on the ranch. He also packed sandwiches, water bottles, and extra batteries. He checked each item carefully, as if preparing for a long journey. Then he drove down the gravel road toward the pasture, the truck's tires kicking up dust that glowed gold in the rising sun. When he arrived at the pasture gate, the herd looked up and snorted softly at his approach. He climbed down and patted the nearest bull, old Jasper, whose white coat gleamed in the morning light. Jasper blinked his gentle brown eyes and leaned into the touch. Frank spoke to him in a low voice, as he always did, feeling the deep calm that came from being near his animals. He moved among the herd, checking each animal's health. They were strong and healthy, their hooves firm. He checked their tags and made notes in a small leather notebook. He laid out the fencing panels near the gate, imagining the line they would form on the HOA lawn. He pictured the surprised faces of the board members when they saw a ring of massive bulls roaming their manicured grass. By mid-morning, his two closest friends arrived. Luis, the old ranch hand who had worked for Frank's family for decades, stepped out of his truck wearing a wide-brimmed hat and a kind smile. Sarah, the town mechanic with quick wit and muscle, followed, carrying a coil of rope and a shovel. They greeted Frank with nods and understanding looks. No questions asked. Frank led them through the pasture and showed them where he wanted the fence panels placed along the edge of the HOA clubhouse lawn. The operation had to be swift and precise. Luis nodded, his weathered face serious. "We'll set the panels up here, here, and here," he said, pointing to stakes Frank had already driven into the ground by the driveway. "Then we'll guide the bulls through that gap over there," Sarah grinned. "I've got extra work lights in my truck," she said. "We'll need them when it's dark." Then she looked at Frank. "Are you sure about this?" she asked. "Quietly, we're risking more than you know." Frank met her gaze with steady eyes. "I know," he said simply. "But if they try to take my home, I'll risk whatever it takes." They worked through the afternoon, testing the panels, tightening the ropes, and placing markers. Frank showed them how to open the pasture gate silently and guide the bulls down a narrow service road leading to the HOA grounds. As they worked, the sun climbed high overhead, warming their backs. Workers at a nearby cabin waved at them, but most residents were gone for the day, leaving their lawns empty and perfect. By dusk, they had everything in place. The panels formed a makeshift enclosure on the front lawn of the clubhouse, with an open channel leading from the service road. Flashlights rested on stakes, aimed at the panels. Bullhorns lay on the ground, ready for Frank's signal. They sat on the tailgate of Luces's truck, sharing sandwiches and quiet conversation. As the sky turned pink and purple, Sarah broke the silence. "You ever think about talking to them again? Maybe they'll back off if they see how serious you are." "With the lawyer?" Frank shook his head. "They've already turned down every chance for compromise. They want my camp gone. This is about more than rules. It's personal for them." He looked toward the distant lake. "They'll learn that people aren't always so easy to push around." Luis took a sip of water and said, "You've always stood up for what's right, Frank. I'm proud to help." Frank felt a swell of gratitude. He knew his friends believed in him. He stood and stretched, feeling the cool breeze of evening. "Let's rest for a while," he said. "We move at midnight. Get some sleep if you can." Night fell, and the world grew quiet. Frank returned to his cabin, heart pounding with anticipation. He paced the small room, reviewing the plan. At midnight, he would slip into the pasture, open the gate, and guide the bulls toward the panels. Sarah and Luis would be at the panel site, using flashlights to guide the bulls down the channel to the clubhouse lawn. Frank would stand at the edge and blow the bullhorns, creating noise but not harm, enough to draw attention. The HOA board would arrive or call animal control, and they would see Frank's determination in the eyes of each bull. He lay down on his cot and closed his eyes, but sleep did not come. His mind raced with images of the operation. He thought of his cabin safe, of his years of memories preserved. Finally, he drifted into a light sleep filled with dreams of stampeding bulls and cheering neighbors. When the old clock in the cabin ticked toward midnight, Frank rose again. He dressed in dark clothes and grabbed a flashlight and a walkie-talkie. He tapped on the window to wake Sarah and Luis. They slipped out, careful not to make noise. They climbed into the back of the pickup, and Frank drove to the pasture gate. Under the cloak of darkness, the sky was clear, and stars glimmered overhead. Frank paused for a moment, breathing deeply and feeling the crisp night air fill his lungs. Then he clicked the gate open. The gate swung wide with a soft creak. The dim light, he saw the shapes of the bulls gathered near the fence. He flicked on his flashlight briefly, then switched it off. He raised his hand and the herd began to move, their large forms sliding through the gate like ghosts. Frank led them by speaking softly, tapping the fence posts with a flashlight. They followed, their hooves thudding on the gravel path. He stayed at the rear, making sure none lagged behind. He guided them down the narrow road toward the HOA grounds. He could see the faint glow of streetlights and the outline of the clubhouse. At the fence panels, Sarah and Louise stood ready. Sarah flashed her flashlight, signaling Frank. He nodded into the walkie-talkie. Now, Sarah opened the first panel, creating a gap. Louise shone his flashlight along the channel, guiding the bulls to the opening. The herd flowed through in single file, their large shoulders brushing the panels, their hooves clicking on the pavement. Frank stepped forward and blew the bullhorns, creating a deep blast that echoed against the clubhouse walls. The bulls stamped and snorted, but they stayed within the panels. They bunched together on the manicured lawn, smelling the crisp grass. The sudden appearance of 20 massive bulls on pristine grass startled even the night creatures. Frank climbed atop a panel and held the bullhorn high. Through the noise, he heard shouts from the darkness. Flashlights swung from windows, and a voice yelled, "What the?" Another voice spoke into a radio. "Animal control, get out here." Frank lowered the bullhorn and used his voice instead. "Show aboard. Listen up. You have until dawn to withdraw your claim on my cabin, or these bulls stay until you do." Herd stamped again, restless but calm. Neighbors peeked from upstairs windows, and some leaned out to watch. In the deep humility of that moment, Frank realized he had done something bold. He had taken a stand not with violence, but with his greatest strength, his loyal herd. He climbed down as sirens wailed in the distance. Sarah and Louise guided him back toward the road. The bulls remained within the panels, their heavy bodies outlined against the floodlights, now aimed at them. Frank led his friends away, heart pounding, but he felt a deep sense of rightness. He had protected his home by showing what he valued most. They returned to the pickup and drove back to the camp without speaking. At the cabin, Frank placed the bullhorns by the door and sat in silence. His body ached, but his spirit was high. He had shown the HOA that he would not back down. Outside, the night held its breath, and the first hint of dawn glowed on the eastern horizon. Frank Dalton closed his eyes for a moment, readying himself for whatever would come next. The early morning air was cool and crisp when the first HOA board members arrived at the clubhouse. They had been woken by the blaring bullhorns and the strange sight of massive bulls standing on their carefully manicured lawns. The board president, Margaret Hill, stepped out of her sleek SUV, her face a mix of shock and anger. Her heels clicked sharply on the stone pathway as she hurried toward the gathering crowd. Frank Dalton stood calmly at the edge of the lawn, watching the board members. As they approached, the bulls moved slowly within the fenced panels, snorting softly and pawing at the damp grass. The sight was both intimidating and strangely peaceful. Neighbors gathered on their porches and at windows, their faces filled with curiosity and some with quiet approval. Margaret's voice cut through the morning stillness. "Mr. Dalton, what is the meaning of this? You cannot just release livestock on HOA property." Frank raised his hands, keeping his tone firm but respectful. "Margaret, I'm standing up. For my home and my rights. The HOA tried to take my camp. They sent me letters demanding I tear it down. This is my land, my property, and I have proof. I will not let you take it without a fight." Board members murmured among themselves, some pulling out phones to call animal control, others speaking in low, anxious voices. A few residents standing at a distance nodded toward Frank with silent support. Louise and Sarah stood beside Frank, their faces serious but calm. Sarah held the walkie-talkie, listening for updates from animal control. The sound of sirens grew louder as the animal control officers arrived in a small truck, their uniforms bright against the green lawn. The officers stepped out and surveyed the scene. One officer approached Frank. "Sir, can you tell us what is happening here?" Frank nodded. "These are my bulls. They're on this land because I am protecting my home. The HOA is trying to seize my camp unfairly. I want to keep this peaceful." The bulls are not dangerous if treated with respect. The officers exchanged glances and carefully inspected the bulls. The animals stood quietly, their eyes watching but not aggressive. The older officer spoke calmly into his radio, requesting a supervisor and animal transport vehicles. Meanwhile, Margaret moved closer to Frank, her voice lowered. You realize this is a serious violation. You could face legal trouble for trespassing and property damage. Frank met her gaze steadily. I know. But this fight is bigger than lawns and rules. It's about standing up to injustice. If you want to fight me in court, then fight me. There. But I will not let my home be taken without a battle. The morning sun climbed higher as more neighbors appeared, bringing coffee and blankets for the officers. Some of the older residents shared stories of Frank's kindness, how he had helped fix their cabins or brought firewood in winter. A few spoke quietly with animal control officers, explaining Frank's history and character. After several tense hours, the animal control supervisor arrived. He spoke with Frank and the board members privately. He said the bulls were calm and healthy and that no immediate removal was necessary unless the animals showed danger. He advised the HOA to consider a legal path rather than trying to force removal in the field. The board, frustrated and tired, agreed to withdraw the immediate threat of eviction, but warned Frank that the legal battle was far from over. 8. Margaret's face showed the strain of realizing this fight would be longer than she expected. As an animal control began organizing a safe way to move the bulls back to the pasture. Frank spoke quietly with Luis and Sarah. This is just the beginning, he said. But they know I'm serious now. Back at the camp, Frank received a call from his attorney. The court had set a date for a hearing to discuss the legality of the HOA's claim. Frank felt a mix of relief and nervousness. The legal system would decide, but his bold stand had bought time and respect. Days passed with letters, phone calls, and neighbors offering support. Some of the HOA members began to speak privately with Frank, proposing talks and possible compromises. Frank listened carefully, but remained firm. His camp was his home and would remain as it had for 30 years. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the trees, Frank stood on his cabin porch watching the bulls graze peacefully. The board's lawn had been restored and the temporary fencing removed. The camp was safe for now. He thought of the power of community, of standing with friends, and of the strength found in quiet courage. Frank knew the fight wasn't over, but he was ready. He had stood his ground, unleashed more than just bulls. He had unleashed his will to protect what mattered most. As the stars began to twinkle, Frank smiled softly. The lake whispered its old song, the camp lights flickered warmly, and somewhere nearby, a loon called in the night. Out. Frank Dalton's Lakeside home was still his, and his story was far from finished. 2. ChatGPT said, the weeks following the bold stand at the HOA lawn were filled with a mix of tension, hope, and unexpected support. Frank woke each day to the familiar sounds of the lake, the gentle ripple of water, the songs of birds, and the lowing of his bulls grazing nearby. But beneath that calm was a steady undercurrent of worry. The court hearing was approaching, and though he had shown the HOA his strength, the legal fight could still go either way. He spent much of his time gathering more evidence and speaking with neighbors. Many had come forward to offer statements about the history of the camp and the kindness Frank had shown over the years. Lucy Carter, his longtime neighbor, brought over old letters she had saved from the HOA that mentioned Frank's camp without complaint. She smiled warmly as she handed them to him. They tried to scare you, but we're all on your side, she said. Emily arrived one sunny afternoon, her bright smile lifting Frank's spirits. She brought boxes of old photographs, letters, and documents from her mother's belongings. Together they sifted through memories, some bittersweet, some joyful, and organized everything into neat piles to present in court. Emily's calm confidence reminded Frank that he was not alone. We're going to win this, Dad, she said. They can't just erase all these years. On the day of the hearing, Frank dressed in his best shirt and sturdy boots. The courthouse was a small brick building in the center of town, its walls worn by time. He entered the courtroom, feeling the weight of the many eyes upon him. The judge, an older woman with kind eyes, listened carefully as both sides presented their cases. Frank's attorney spoke clearly about the survey maps, the original permits, and the many years Frank had peacefully owned and maintained the camp. The HOA lawyer argued their new rules and the need for order in the community. But as the judge reviewed the evidence, she asked pointed questions about fairness, the timing of the HOA's claim, and the spirit of the community. After a long pause, the judge ruled in Frank's favor. The HOA's attempt to seize the camp was unlawful. She ordered them to withdraw all fines and allowed Frank to keep his camp as it was. The courtroom filled with quiet applause. Frank felt a wave of relief wash over him. Years of worry and fear seemed to melt away in that moment. Back at the camp, the news spread quickly. Neighbors came by to congratulate him, bringing homemade pies and fresh flowers. Frank sat on his porch, watching the sun set over the lake, feeling a deep gratitude. His home was safe, but the victory was more than legal. The community had grown stronger. Frank's boldness had inspired others to stand up for what was right. The HOA board began to change, with new members who listened more closely to the residents. Frank found himself invited to meetings not as an opponent, but as a respected voice. One afternoon, Emily and Frank sat by the lake, skipping stones, and talking about the future. Emily spoke of bringing her family back to visit, of teaching her own children the value of this special place. Frank smiled, feeling a warmth that went beyond the setting sun. He thought about the bulls, those gentle giants who had helped him make his stand. They were more than animals. They were symbols of strength, patience, and loyalty. Frank often walked among them, feeling the calm that came with their steady presence. As the seasons turned, the camp remained a haven for Frank and his family. He repaired the roof, planted newberry bushes, and cleared the trails again. The lake's waters shimmered with life, reflecting the endless sky above. At night, Frank would sit on the porch with a pipe in his hand, listening to the sounds of the forest. Sometimes neighbors stopped by for a chat or a cup of tea. Stories were shared, laughter echoed, and new memories were made. Frank Dalton had faced the threat of losing his home and responded not with fear, but with courage. He had stood for his place in the world, for the peace and history of his camp. And in doing so, he reminded everyone that sometimes the strongest protection comes from standing firm, whether with legal papers, loyal friends, or even a herd of bulls. The lake whispered its quiet song under the moonlight, and Frank felt at peace. His camp was safe, his spirit strong, and his story one of resilience and hope.